Military simulations, also known informally as war games, are simulations in which theories of warfare can be tested and refined without the need for actual hostilities. Many professional analysts object to the term war games as this is generally taken to be referring to the civilian hobby, thus the preference for the term simulation. Simulations exist in many different forms, with varying degrees of realism. In recent times, the scope of simulations has widened to include not only military but also political and social factors, which are seen as inextricably entwined in a realistic warfare model. Whilst many governments make use of simulation, both individually and collaboratively, little is known about it outside professional circles. Yet modeling is often the means by which governments test and refine their military and political policies. Military simulations are seen as a useful way to develop tactical, strategical and doctrinal solutions. But critics argue that the conclusions drawn from such models are inherently flawed, due to the approximate nature of the models used. The simulation spectrum. The term military simulation can cover a wide spectrum of activities, ranging from full-scale field exercises to abstract computerized models that can proceed with little or no human involvement, such as the RAND Strategy Assessment Center. As a general scientific principle, the most reliable data comes from actual observation and the most reliable theories depend on it. This also holds true in military analysis, where analysts look towards live field exercises and trials as providing data likely to be realistic and verifiable. One can readily discover, for example, how long it takes to construct a pontoon bridge under given conditions with given manpower. Any form of training can be regarded as a simulation, in the strictest sense of the word. However, many if not most exercises take place not to test new ideas or models, but to provide the participants with the skills to operate within existing ones. Full-scale military exercises, or even smaller-scale ones, are not always feasible or even desirable. Availability of resources, including money, is a significant factor. It costs a lot to release troops and materiel from any standing commitments, to transport them to a suitable location, and then to cover additional expenses such as petroleum, oil and lubricants usage, equipment maintenance, supplies and consumables replenishment and other items. In addition, certain warfare models do not lend themselves to verification using this realistic method. It might, for example, prove counterproductive to accurately test an attrition scenario by killing one's own troops. Moving away from the field exercise, it is often more convenient to test a theory by reducing the level of personnel involvement. Map exercises can be conducted involving senior officers and planners, but without the need to physically move around any troops. These retain some human input, and thus can still reflect to some extent the human imponderables that make warfare so challenging to model, with the advantage of reduced costs and increased accessibility. A map exercise can also be conducted with far less forward planning than a full-scale deployment, making it an attractive option for more minor simulations that would not merit anything larger, as well as for very major operations where cost or secrecy is an issue. Increasing the level of abstraction still further, simulation moves towards an environment readily recognized by civilian wargamers. This type of simulation can be manual, implying no computer involvement, computer-assisted, or fully computerized. Manual simulations have probably been in use in some form since mankind first went to war. Chess can be regarded as a form of military simulation. In more recent times, the forerunner of modern simulations was the Prussian game Krieg Spiel, which appeared around 1811 and is sometimes credited with the Prussian victory in the Franco-Prussian War. It was distributed to each Prussian regiment and they were ordered to play it regularly, prompting a Visitung, German officer to declare in 1824, "It's not a game at all. It's training for war." Eventually so many rules sprang up, as each regiment improvised their own variations. Two versions came into use. One, known as rigid Krieg Spiel, was played by strict adherence to the lengthy rulebook. The other, free Krieg Spiel, was governed by the decisions of human umpires. Each version had its advantages and disadvantages. Rigid Krieg Spiel contained rules covering most situations, and the rules were derived from historical battles where those same situations had occurred, making the simulation verifiable and rooted in observable data, which some later American models discarded. However, its prescriptive nature acted against any impulse of the participants towards free and creative thinking. Conversely, free Kriegspiel could encourage this type of thinking, as its rules were open to interpretation by umpires and could be adapted during operation. This very interpretation, though, tended to negate the verifiable nature of the simulation, as different umpires might well adjudge the same situation in different ways, especially where there was a lack of historical precedent. In addition, it allowed umpires to weight the outcome, consciously or otherwise. The above arguments are still cogent in the modern, computer-heavy military simulation environment. There remains a recognized place for umpires as arbiters of a simulation. Hence the persistence of manual simulations in war colleges throughout the world. Both computer-assisted and entirely computerized simulations are common as well, with each being used as required by circumstances. The RAND Corporation is one of the best-known designers of military simulations for the U.S. government and Air Force, and one of the pioneers of the political military simulation. Their SAFE simulation is an example of a manual simulation, with one or more teams of up to 10 participants being sequestered in separate rooms and the moves being overseen by an independent director and his staff. Such simulations may be conducted over a few days. An initial scenario is presented to the players with appropriate historical, political and military background information. They then have a set amount of time to discuss and formulate a strategy, with input from the directors. Umpires is required. Where more than one team is participating, teams may be divided on partisan lines. Traditionally blue and red are used as designations, with blue representing the home nation and red the opposition. In this case, the teams will work against each other, their moves and counter-moves being relayed to their opponents by control, who will also adjudicate on the results of such moves. At set intervals, control will declare a change in the scenario, usually of a period of days or weeks, and present the evolving situation to the teams based on their reading of how it might develop as a result of the moves made. For example, blue team might decide to respond to the Gulf conflict by moving a carrier battle group into the area whilst simultaneously using diplomatic channels to avert hostilities. Red team, on the other hand, might decide to offer military aid to one side or another, perhaps seeing an opportunity to gain influence in the region and counter blue's initiatives. At this point control could declare a week has now passed, and present an updated scenario to the players. Possibly the situation has deteriorated further and blue must now decide if they wish to pursue the military option, or alternatively tensions might have eased and the onus now lies on red as to whether to escalate by providing more direct aid to their clients. Computer-assisted simulations are really just a development of the manual simulation, and again there are different variants on the theme. Sometimes the computer assistance will be nothing more than a database to help umpires keep track of information during a manual simulation. At other times one or other of the teams might be replaced by a computer-simulated opponent. This can reduce the umpire's role to interpreter of the data produced by the agent, or obviate the need for an umpire altogether. Most commercial wargames designed to run on computers fall into this category. Where agents replace both human teams, the simulation can become fully computerized and can, with minimal supervision, run by itself. The main advantage of this is the ready accessibility of the simulation, beyond the time required to program and update the computer models. No special requirements are necessary. A fully computerized simulation can run at virtually any time and in almost any location, the only equipment needed being a laptop computer. An additional important advantage is the ability to perform many hundreds or even thousands of iterations in the time that it would take a manual simulation to run once. This means statistical information can be gleaned from such a model, outcomes can be quoted in terms of probabilities, and plans developed accordingly. Removing the human element entirely means the results of the simulation are only as good as the model itself. Validation thus becomes extremely significant. Data must be correct, and must be handled correctly by the model. The modeler's assumptions must adequately reflect reality, or the results will be nonsense. Various mathematical formulae have been devised over the years to attempt to predict everything from the effective casualties on morale to the speed of movement of an army in difficult terrain. One of the best known is the Lanchester square law formulated by the British engineer Frederick Lanchester in 1914. He expressed the fighting strength of a modern force as proportional to the square of its numerical strength multiplied by the fighting value of its individual units. The Lanchester law is often known as the attrition model, as it can be applied to show the balance between opposing forces as one side or the other loses numerical strength. Heuristic or stochastic. Another method of categorizing military simulations is to divide them into two broad areas. Heuristic simulations are those that are run with the intention of stimulating research and problem solving. They are not necessarily expected to provide empirical solutions. Stochastic simulations are those that involve, at least to some extent, an element of chance. Most military simulations fall somewhere in between these two definitions. Although manual simulations lend themselves more to the heuristic approach and computerized ones to the stochastic, manual simulations, as described above, are often run to explore what-if scenario and take place as much to provide the participants with some insight into decision-making processes and crisis management as to provide concrete conclusions. Indeed, such simulations do not even require a conclusion. Once a set number of moves has been made and the time allotted has run out, the scenario will finish regardless of whether the original situation has been resolved or not. Computerized simulations can readily incorporate chance in the form of some sort of randomized element, and can be run many times to provide outcomes in terms of probabilities. In such situations, it sometimes happens that the unusual results are of more interest than the expected ones. For example, if a simulation modeling an invasion of nation A by nation B was put through 100 iterations to determine the likely depth of penetration into A's territory by B's forces after 4 weeks, an average result could be calculated. Examining those results, it might be found that the average penetration was around 50 kilometers. However, there would also be outlying results on the ends of the probability curve. At one end, it could be that the FEBA is found to have hardly moved at all. At the other, penetration could be hundreds of kilometers instead of tens. The analyst would then examine these outliers to determine why this was the case. In the first instance, it might be found that the computer model's random number generator had delivered results such that A's divisional artillery was much more effective than normal. In the second, it might be that the model generated a spell of particularly bad weather that kept A's air force grounded. This analysis can then be used to make recommendations perhaps to look at ways in which artillery can be made more effective, or to invest in more all-weather fighter and ground attack aircraft. Political military simulations. Since Karl von Clausewitz's famous declaration, war is merely a continuation of politics by other means, military planners have attempted to integrate political goals with military goals in their planning with varying degrees of commitment. Post-World War II, political military simulation in the West, initially almost exclusively concerned with the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower, has more recently focused on the global war on terror. It became apparent, in order to model an ideologically motivated enemy in general, political factors had to be taken into account any realistic grand strategic simulation. This differed markedly with the traditional approach to military simulations. Krieg Spiel was concerned only with the movement and engagement of military forces, and subsequent simulations were similarly focused in their approach. Following the Prussian success in 1866 against Austria at Sadowa, the Austrians, French, British, Italians, Japanese and Russians all began to make use of wargaming as a training tool. The United States was relatively late to adopt the trend, but by 1889 wargaming was firmly embedded in the culture of the U.S. Navy. Political military simulations take a different approach to their purely military counterparts. Since they are largely concerned with policy issues rather than battlefield performance, they tend to be less prescriptive in their operation. However, various mathematical techniques have arisen in an attempt to bring rigor to the modeling process. One of these techniques is known as game theory. A commonly used method is that of non-zero-sum analysis, in which score tables are drawn up to enable selection of a decision such that a favorable outcome is produced regardless of the opponent's decision. It was not until 1954 the first modern political military simulation appeared, and it was the United States that would elevate simulation to a tool of statecraft. The impetus was U.S. concern about the burgeoning nuclear arms race. A permanent gaming facility was created in the Pentagon and various professional analysts were brought in to run it, including the social scientist Herbert Goldhamer, economist Andrew Marshall and MIT professor Lincoln P. Bloomfield. Notable U.S. political military simulations run since World War II include the aforementioned SAFE, Straw and Cow. The typical political military simulation is a manual or computer-assisted heuristic-type model, and many research organizations and think tanks throughout the world are involved in providing this service to governments. During the Cold War, the RAND Corporation and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, amongst others, ran simulations for the Pentagon that included modeling the Vietnam War, the fall of the Shah of Iran, the rise of pro-communist regimes in South America, tensions between India, Pakistan and China, and various potential flashpoints in Africa and Southeast Asia. Both MIT and RAND remain heavily involved in U.S. military simulation, along with institutions such as Harvard, Stanford, and the National Defense University. Other nations have their equivalent organizations, such as Cranfield Institute's Defense Academy in the United Kingdom. Participants in the Pentagon simulations were sometimes a very high rank, including members of Congress and White House insiders as well as senior military officers. The identity of many of the participants remains secret even today. It is a tradition in the U.S. simulations that participants are guaranteed anonymity. The main reason for this is that occasionally they may take on a role or express an opinion that is at odds with their professional or public stance, and thus could harm their reputation or career if their in-game persona became widely known. It is also traditional that in-game roles are played by participants of an equivalent rank in real life, although this is not a hard and fast rule and often disregarded. Whilst the major purpose of a political military simulation is to provide insights that can be applied to real-world situations, it is very difficult to point to a particular decision as arising from a certain simulation, especially as the simulations themselves are usually classified for years, and, even when released into the public domain, are sometimes heavily censored. This is not only due to the unwritten policy of non-attribution, but to avoid disclosing sensitive information to a potential adversary. This has been true within the simulation environment itself as well. Former U.S. President Ronald Reagan was a keen visitor to simulations conducted in the 1980s, but as an observer only. An official explained, "No president should ever disclose his hand, not even in a war game." Political military simulations remain in widespread use today. Modern simulations are concerned not with a potential war between superpowers, but more with international cooperation. The rise of global terrorism and smaller brushfire conflicts such as those in Kosovo, Bosnia, Sierra Leone, and the Sudan. An example is the MNE series of simulations that have been run from the Ataturk Wargaming Simulation and Culture Center in Istanbul over recent years. The latest, MNE4, took place in early 2006. MNE includes participants from Australia, Canada, Finland, France, Germany, Sweden, the United Kingdom, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the United States, and is designed to explore the use of diplomatic, economic and military power in the global arena.